If God does not exist, the applicability of mathematics is just a happy coincidence. But the applicability of mathematics is not just a happy coincidence. Therefore, God exists. Eugene Wigner was right. The effectiveness of mathematics in the physical world is quite literally a miracle, which is best explained by the existence of God.
Or is it? In fact, are we even justified in considering mathematics to be miraculous? And what's more, is the only other option to God really just happy coincidence? These are the primary questions we'll delve into within this response to Dr. William Lane Craig's mathematical argument for the existence of God. I am Stephen Woodford, and thanks for joining me. Let's get to it.
Why does mathematics work?
Well, that depends on what you mean by mathematics, and no, I am not pulling a Jordan Peterson on you here. The debate over what exactly mathematics is, that is, whether it's invented or discovered, has raged since the time of Pythagoras, and as it stands there are many competing schools of thought which differ greatly in how they would answer the question of why mathematics works. This, in fact, is my first objection to Craig's presentation. Despite the fact that he is well versed in mathematics, having studied Cantorian set theory for his work on the Kalām, he has not provided us with a clear definition of mathematics, and so we're going to have to infer his definition from his surrounding words. To be clear, this is not an objection to the argument, but rather its presentation. In philosophy, definitions are paramount, especially when the definition of a key word is contentious.
Think about it. Mathematical entities like numbers, sets, and equations are non-physical and abstract. They can't cause anything. Yet, for some reason, the physical universe operates mathematically.
Mathematical entities such as the aforementioned are non-physical and abstract, yes, but the things they were invented to refer to are not. The earliest signs of Homo sapiens exercising mathematics dates back at least 5,000 years to the kingdoms of Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt, in which arithmetic, algebra, and geometry were employed for the purposes of trade, commerce, astronomy, and taxation. As a proponent of the non-Platonic view of mathematics known as logicism, I would thus argue that mathematics is an expression of logic that holds only so much as its axioms correlate with reality. To answer the opening question through this prism, mathematics works because that is precisely what we've designed it to do. So much so, in fact, that when it doesn't work, which is to say when it doesn't correlate with reality, we alter its axioms so that it does. To ask, why is mathematics so unreasonably effective, is to ask, why is reason so unreasonably effective?
As Galileo put it, the book of nature is written in the language of mathematics. Scientists do not use mathematics merely as a convenient way of organizing the data. They believe that mathematical relationships reflect real aspects of the physical world.
As already mentioned, mathematicians are far from united in their views of what mathematics is, let alone what its relationship is to the physical world. To build his narrative of mathematics being miraculous, Craig is careful to only quote mathematicians who share his view, and in doing so his presentation heavily gives the impression that mathematics is discovered as opposed to invented. To bolster this point, here's Paul Davies, the physicist that Craig has just quoted, owning the fact that his views are a minority among the scientific community.
And in that view, you are distinctly in the minority among at least the physicists and mathematicians and scientists that I know.
Right.
And you don't deny that you're in that minority in that thinking, a place that you apparently like to inhabit.
Yes, I freely admit that most of my colleagues would not agree with me.
Whereas the last objection was purely of Craig's presentation, this objection is against both his presentation and argument. Craig spends the bulk of his presentation selling the false impression that scientists, mathematicians, and physicists can't provide a naturalistic account of mathematics, which is vital for his argument to work. If mathematics is not miraculous, his argument is baffling.
Pythagoras discovered that when a vibrating string is shortened by half, it plays the same note one octave higher.
From here, Craig lists many of humanity's most astonishing discoveries, from Newton's laws to Maxwell's radio waves to Einstein's general relativity, all while emphasizing their eloquent mathematical expressions. And then he asks the big question.
How do we explain the astonishing applicability of math to the physical world? In 1960, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist and mathematician Eugene Wigner published an article that stunned the scientific community entitled the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics in the natural sciences. Wigner concluded that the effectiveness of mathematics is a miracle, which we neither understand nor deserve.
Wigner's article was, and indeed still is, contentious among mathematicians, largely due to there being so many schools of thought. But it's my opinion that Craig, in his theological fervour, does Wigner two disservices. The first is that he misappropriates Wigner's words to fit the narrative of mathematics being a miracle in the divine sense of the word, as opposed to the extraordinarily welcome sense of the word. Within his short article, Wigner uses the word miracle 12 times, as he considers, for instance, the fact that we can predict anything in the future to be a miracle, and he compares the miracle of mathematics playing a role in quantum theory to the miracle that the human mind can string 1,000 arguments together without getting into contradictions. And the second disservice I believe Craig does to Wigner is that by so misappropriating his words, Craig gives the impression that Wigner was a theist, when in fact he was an atheist.
Wigner concluded that the effectiveness of mathematics is a miracle, which we neither understand nor deserve.
But in order to present this interpretation, Craig has had to fuse the title of Wigner's paper with various disjointed parts of his concluding paragraph. For what it's worth, here's how Wigner actually concluded. The miracle of the appropriateness of the language of mathematics for the formation of the laws of physics is a wonderful gift, which we neither understand nor deserve. We should be grateful for it and hope that it will remain valid in future research and that it will extend, for better or worse, to our pleasure, even though perhaps to our bafflement, to wide branches of learning.
Why is mathematics so effective?
It's at this point that Craig moves on, but I'd like to plant a clear flag here before we do the same. Craig has not demonstrated that the effectiveness of mathematics is miraculous. The reason that mathematics is so unreasonably effective is the same reason that reason is so unreasonably effective. It's because 1, when it's not effective, we alter its axioms so that it is, and 2, the universe is fairly consistent, and so it's no surprise that the tools that we created for our own environment happen to be applicable to other environments.
Why is mathematics so effective? Philosophers who address this question fall into two camps. Naturalists, who believe that all that exists concretely is space-time and its physical contents. They exclude supernatural causes. And theists, who believe in a God who created the universe.
The definition of naturalism, like mathematics, is hotly debated, and the one that Craig presents is as uncharitable as to define Christians as those who believe in creationism and a young earth. A more charitable, and indeed accurate definition of a naturalist is one who believes that the laws and forces of the universe are entirely governed by natural as opposed to supernatural regulations. Predictive mathematics, ironically enough, depends on naturalism. Our predictions are predicated on the consistency of the laws of nature, and a supernatural intervention would violate our predictions since we would not have accounted for it.
Naturalists cannot provide a reasonable explanation for why mathematics applies to the physical world. It's just a happy coincidence. But this is no explanation at all. At most, naturalists can say that it's not surprising that math applies to the world, because the world itself just happens to have a mathematical structure, so of course mathematics applies to it. But this explanation is unsatisfactory for two reasons.
This is quite the straw man. There are many ways in which naturalists can account for why mathematics applies to the physical world. I've already given you my own, and I'll do so again a little later, but for now, here are just 3 alternative accounts from, in this order, theoretical physicist Sabine Hossenfelder, theoretical physicist Steven Weinberg, and then cognitive linguist and philosopher George Lakoff.
But maybe you do not agree that the effectiveness of mathematics is all that unreasonable.
No, I do not think that it is all that unreasonable that mathematics is effective in the natural sciences. Because what is mathematics about? It is a way to describe patterns, to describe regularities, and that's exactly what we do in the natural sciences.
First of all, how accurate is mathematics in explaining physics?
I don't think mathematics can be ever regarded as an explanation in itself of anything. And this has not always been well understood. Perhaps it's even still controversial. Physical theories aren't the way they are because of principles of mathematics. Principles of mathematics are the language in which we state our physical principles, and they are the intellectual tools we use for calculating the consequences of those principles. But nothing is the way it is because of some mathematical principles.
There is still a mathematics in the world, even if human beings never existed or if brains never existed.
It's not in the world. The world is as it is. Let's take a very simple case. Take a spiral nebula. The logarithmic spiral is not in the nebula. It's in your understanding of the nebula. The marvelous thing about mathematics is that we can create mathematics with our brains that fit phenomena in the world remarkably. It is not a miracle that that's the case, because we have the capacity to see and understand the world, to categorize it in terms of what our brains do, and then we can create a mathematics out of that in a systematic way using what our brains allow us.
In case you want to hear more voices such as those just shown, know that all three of the prior clips are from Robert Lawrence Kuhn's excellent show, Closer to Truth, which I've linked below for your convenience. Okay, back to Craig's argument.
First, a great deal of mathematics and science cannot be physically realized. For example, imaginary numbers and infinite dimensional spaces.
Indeed, much of mathematics can't be physically realized, and it's for this reason that while I recognize mathematics to be one of humanity's greatest tools, I do not assert that all that we can infer from its axioms necessarily exist in reality. To quote Einstein, as far as the laws of mathematics refer to reality, they are not certain. As far as they are certain, they do not refer to reality.
And second, this answer still doesn't explain why the physical universe has such a stunningly elegant mathematical structure.
At the risk of sounding like a broken record, it's because the laws of the universe are robustly consistent, and thus the mathematics we develop to account for our own macroscopic physics is applicable to physical realms far beyond what we inhabit. This is not strange or mysterious, let alone miraculous. It's expected.
By contrast, for theists, mathematics works so well in the physical world because God has chosen to create the world according to the plan he had in mind.
Right, so according to Craig, the answer, mathematics is effective because the universe is relatively consistent, is unsatisfactory, but the answer, mathematics is effective because of God, is somehow perfectly satisfactory. God is a non-answer. It's the equivalent of because I said so. It not only doesn't answer the how element intrinsic to the why question, but it actively shuts down investigation. It stalls progress and rots the mind. When Newton's laws did not account for the trajectory of all the celestial bodies in the solar system, he invoked God, and in doing so turned his brilliant mind off. So far as he was concerned, he had answered the question, but he had not. There was a natural explanation that not only answered why, but more crucially answered how. And the answer, funny enough, required us to alter our mathematical axioms.
Mathematics and physics work so well together because the same mind that designed the universe on a mathematical model also built the universe on the same mathematical model. All of this adds up to an argument for the existence of God that goes like this. If God does not exist, the applicability of mathematics is just a happy coincidence.
If you, like me, are not convinced of the proposition that the effectiveness of mathematics is miraculous in the religious sense, then this premise will strike you, as it does me, as bewildering. Charles Darwin once wrote that a mathematician is a blind man in a dark room looking for a black cat which isn't there, and I would say that this fairly summarises the fact that while we have good reason to suspect that the mathematics that applies to our environment also applies to radically different environments, we do not know with certainty that it does. In any case, I, and evidently many mathematicians and physicists, do not consider the effectiveness of mathematics to be unreasonable, let alone miraculous. I would in fact be more shocked and find it more unreasonable if our mathematics did not apply to other macroscopic environments. This is to say that so far as I'm concerned, Craig is committing a black and white fallacy, in which black is God and white is coincidence, or chance. He spent a total of 30 seconds attempting to justify why the only other option to God is happy coincidence. But as expressed earlier, naturalists have a plethora of ways to account for the effectiveness of mathematics, including the one I have given throughout.
But the applicability of mathematics is not just a happy coincidence. Therefore, God exists.
Dr. Craig is very often presented as a theist of strong intellectual stature, and I have to say, I'm someone who shares this notion. Craig has challenged me, in fact, more than any other theist I've read, but his argumentation here strikes me as jarringly poor. By assuming that the properties of the universe are built upon mathematics, rather than that mathematics is built upon the properties of the universe, Craig has put the cart before the horse. His argument is essentially a reskin of presuppositionalism, in which he's replaced the laws of logic with the axioms of mathematics. Now, to ensure that Craig's specific presentation here isn't simply a weak rendition, I've listened to him debating the philosopher Dr. Graham Oppy on this very argument, and I've digested just about every video on YouTube I can find of him discussing the topic. But I found nothing of greater substance than what's found in this short, polished presentation.
Take mystery number 1, the applicability of mathematics. I think this is a huge issue.
If I'm honest, this is the kind of argument I'd expect from the likes of Frank Turek, as opposed to Craig. Because of this, I can't help but knock the feeling that I'm missing something. So if any of you think that I am, then please do let me know and I'll make another video. Anyhow, as always, I'm Stephen Woodford, thank you kindly for the view, and an extra special thank you to my wonderful patrons and those of you who have supported the channel via other means.
The thing is that you call it a solution. The trouble is I think my problem is it's too vague. I don't see how you can do much with this particular view. You see, we when it comes to the explanation of how a physical world operates in terms of mathematics, it's extraordinarily precise, and one can say an awful lot about that. But a statement like the one you make here worries me because it's, you can call it a solution, but it doesn't tell us very much.